Good morning. I'm James Dean Minford Jr. This is a project of mine that I've been working on for about 30 years, and it's to give you a composition of the Minford and Jones family. The Minford are my dad's parents, and the Joneses are my mother's parents. So I've accumulated a lot of photographs over the years, and I wanted to get so that people know the faces of the relatives, not just a name on a piece of paper. To give you a little bit of a background, the Minfords came from Wales. Originally, we thought they were from Scotland, but actually we found my dad did a trip and discovered that there are no Minfords in Scotland, and he discovered that they are from Wales. As a matter of fact, there is a town at the end of the railroad track in Wales that's spelled almost exactly like Minford, and it's a hard coal mining area. Now, that's what the original Minford came to the United States in the 1860s. He was William Minford I, and he was brought over by Consolidated Coal Mine to work in the coal mine in Large, Pennsylvania. Now, Large is a little small town right outside of Clairton, right next to Route 51. So William Minford I came there to be the superintendent of the coal mine. Now, the Joneses, my mother's side, the Joneses all came from England and Ireland. That's where basically they were from, mostly from England. Okay, so let's go to some of the pictures here. This is a picture taken in Ma Jones. Now, I'm going to give you some definitions first. Sometimes you'll hear me refer to myself as Jamie, because up to age 12, I was known to everybody as Jamie. My brother John, up to age 18, he was known as Kent. After 18, he became John. So if you hear flip-flop, I'm going to probably call myself Jamie because it's less confusing because my grandfather's name was Jim. So to keep the two separate, we'll do that. Now, this is the first picture. This is probably taken in the 1950s. It's taken at Alberta Richardson Jones. That's my grandmother on my mother's side. And this was taken in her living room. On the far left, we have Ma Jones. Sitting, we have my mother, Darlene. Standing next, we have B and B. Wentley. In the middle, we have Leona Radcliffe. And we have Gagey, my Aunt Gagey. Her name was Gertrude Byers. And then we have Aunt Cora. Now, Aunt Cora, Gagey, and Ma were all sisters of my grandmother. So, and the little skinny girl sitting next to the fireplace, that was B. Wentley. You had Nellie and B. Wentley. Nellie and B. Wentley and Leona Radcliffe were at all of the family get-togethers in my grandmother's house, and they were all old maids, but they always got invited to every Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day. Okay, next we have, this is at my grandfather Minford's house. This is going to be on the far left. That's going to be Mrs. Hansford. Next to Mrs. Hansford was a friend of the Minfords, no relation. Next to her is Aunt Pline. Aunt Pline was a relative of my grandfather Minford on his mother's side. And the next person is Dean Minford, my dad. The little boy being held is me. I'm guessing I'm probably 6, 7 years old. And my grandmother, Ma Stella. The man on the right, I don't know who it is. And the woman down, sort of a small woman, I don't know who it is. Down on the very bottom of the picture, you have John, who was just born, so this had to be like 1954, and Annie Winklevoss. Now, I can just give you a quick synopsis. Annie Winklevoss is a relative of Pop Jim. And what's interesting is that Annie Winklevoss was a student in Ma Stella's class. And Ma Stella, my grandmother, she taught elementary school in the borough of Wilson, which is down as a suburb of Clairton. And my grandfather, Minford, Jim, went to a play that Anne Winklevoss was in when she was in 3rd or 4th grade, and her teacher was Stella. So that is how my grandfather Minford met my grandmother Stella, was because of Annie Winklevoss's play. Okay, this slide is now a picture of my dad's house. This was on Route 51 in Pleasant Hills. He built this house right after he came home from the Second World War, and this house is actually about 6 houses down from what they call the Cloverleaf. That's where Lebanon Church Road Boulevard intersects with Route 51. This picture has, on the far left, it has me with one of my guns. We were big on guns back in those days. Behind me is Ma Jones, my grandmother. Next to her is Aunt Gagey, that's Gertrude Byers, then Stella Minford, and to the far right is Aunt Had. Aunt Had is Aunt Gagey's husband's sister. Aunt Had always came to those affairs because she had no family. And so as a result, we used to have a lot of people come that weren't really relations to our family because my mother was an only child. My dad was an only child. My dad's dad was an only child. My dad's mother was only one child in the family till her mother passed away and the father remarried, and so Ma Stella never had much interest in the rest of the family with the exception of Uncle Franklin Barber. So as a result, we used to have all these get-togethers with people who were not really members of the family. Now this was the dining room of the Pleasant Hills house, and you notice the drapes on the wall. This was a Japanese design that my dad brought home from the Second World War. My dad was in Japan. Okay, this is a picture. Now we're moving back out to the farm, and this is a photograph in Ma Jones's dining room. Now, with the far person and the far left is Gagey, Aunt Gagey Byers. Lon Jones has his head turned away from us. Ma Jones is next. Who the man sitting in front of the window, I'm not sure. The face turning us as you come around is Darlene, my mother. And the last picture on the far right is Art Byers. That was Aunt Gagey's husband. As a quick, you'll note, Lon Jones appears to have a very dark head. And there's a famous story in the family that they all went back in the 30s. They showed up at a black rally or something, and they sat down there, and the blacks took a collection, and they passed the plate around. And when they got to my grandfather Jones, they passed the plate past him because they thought he was black. But actually, you'll see a picture later on in Miami. The rest of his body was snow white. Have no idea how his head got so dark. Now, this is back down at my dad's house in Pleasant Hills. On the far left, again, we have Ma Jones. Then we have Gertrude Byers, Aunt Gagey. Then you have me down in the bottom. My dad is sitting at the head of the table with Uncle Art Byers, and my grandfather Jones. But you can see how dark my grandfather Jones is. And to the right of grandfather Jones is Stella Minford, and Jim Minford is sitting on the far right-hand side. I have probably fewer photographs of Jim Minford than anyone else. I don't know why, but he never had his picture taken much. One of the reasons he didn't like to have his picture taken, he had Bell's palsy, which made his jaws droop, which meant he couldn't wear his dentures. So he was never ever had any teeth. So he tended not to like to have his pictures taken. Okay, this is Ma Jones is on the left. Lon Jones is on the right. Ma Jones was originally a Richardson. She came from Frostburg, Maryland. There were 10 people in her family. Gagey was the youngest. Ma was the second youngest, and she had 8 others. The father died right after Gagey was born. So basically, Roseanne Richardson had to bring up 10 children all by herself. Now, this is back in the days when there was no welfare or Social Security or aid to dependent children. So she had to basically take care of all 10 children all by herself. Now, Lon Jones was a fantastic piano player. He did his first piano recital at age 3, and he got his start on the piano. He used to make money by playing in the old silent movie pictures. There would be a movie screen, and Lon Jones would come in, right in front of the screen, and then play the piano. And he would have to play music to correspond which was ever happening on the screen. So if it was a romantic scene with a man and a woman, then he would have to play a romantic piece of music. If it was an action piece and a chase, then he would have to play, and he would just go from one piece to another. And he would do this basically all day long. But he was very, very good at music. He also went, when he was young, to Robert Morris Business School. Now, this is back in around 1900, and very few people went to college in 1900. And he got went to business school, got a degree, and he worked for United States Steel in Clairton. And he ended up having 40 people who worked under him in the accounting department. And he ended up, after he retired from U.S. Steel from 50 years, he worked at Swift Homes, which is a manufacturer of homes. Okay, this is the Minford porch of Jim and Stella Minford's house at the farm. Now, let me explain the farm because it'll make things easier as things go along. I was very, very lucky when I was a child. Jim Minford, who lived in Wilson. Now, Wilson was a suburb of Clairton. Wilson used to be its own borough, but they were eventually incorporated by Clairton into the Clairton. And Wilson was right down next to the steel mill on Route 837. And Jim Minford originally had a Studebaker dealership, which he got in 1917. Between 1917 and 1940, he had a Studebaker dealership. And between 1930 and 1960, he had a General Electric appliance store right next to the Studebaker dealership. Now, at 1949, he wanted to get out of Clairton, which was very dirty and dusty because it was right next to the coal byproducts plant. I'm amazed that my dad and my grandparents all didn't die of lung cancer because the pollution was so bad. In those days, when I would go down to my grandfather's store, if you would look on the other side of the Monongahela River, because my grandfather's store was right next to the coal byproducts plant. If you looked on the other side of the river, it was entirely bare. There was absolutely no green vegetation of any kind on that whole hillside. That's because the pollution from the coal byproducts plant killed everything. So there was luckily the wind blew the other way from my grandfather's store. 1949, my grandfather decides to come out in the country. He comes out to Jefferson Borough, and he buys 8 acres of property. Of the 8 acres of property, he kept 6 acres for himself, which he had like a farm. He had orchard, he had crops to grow, he had gardens everywhere. As a matter of fact, Jim and Stella used to sell a lot of their vegetables to Marcini's grocery store in Clairton. Now, he took, of the 8 acres, he sold 1 acre to my grandparents, Lon and Bertie Jones, and he sold 1 acre to Gagey buyers and art buyers. So this was fantastic for a kid because what child has one set of grandparents living 500 feet from the other set of grandparents, and then 50 feet from the great aunt and great uncle? So I had 6 relatives all living on this same 8-acre section. As a matter of fact, that's one where I started to get heavy because my grandparent Jones would eat dinner at 5 o'clock. So I would go to Jones's and I would have dinner. Well, the Minfords didn't get home from their business until 6 o'clock. Well, then I would go over to Minfords and I would have dinner over at Minfords at 6 o'clock. So I would have 2 dinners a night between the 2 grandparents. Now, looking at this picture again, you have Mrs. Hansford is in the red. Mrs. Hansford was a good friend of my mother, my grandmother, Ma Stella. And then you have Ma Jones is in the blue, and then I'm sure Art's back there. Nellie and B are on the... But this Minford porch that you see, that's where we had all of our summer picnics. Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, all took place on the Minford porch. Okay, now this is the front of the Minford house. You can see the porch in the background. And this is Stella Minford, Jim, starting from the left, Stella Minford, James Briggs Minford, he was often called JB, Alberta Jones, Mrs. Hanford, my mother, and I think my mother's got a dog or something somewhere. But anyhow, this is in front of the Minford house. Now, Minfords moved here in 1949. In 1950, at Thanksgiving, we had the largest snowstorm in the history of Pittsburgh. I forget, it was like 4 feet of snow. So we had come to the Minfords for Thanksgiving dinner. We were trapped here for 4 days. We could not get out because of the snow was so deep. And Pop Jim and Pop, whose house was maybe 500 feet away, they actually started digging a tunnel or digging a trench at opposite ends, and that's the only way you could get from one house to another, and the snow was 4 foot deep. Jim Minford had to eventually call up after 4 days and have somebody come out from Clairton with a backhoe to dig them out of the snowdrift. It was that deep. Also, after 2 days, we had ran out of milk, and I was only 2 years old. So Jim Minford, who was good friends with the owner of this farm, whose name was Seiler, called up old farmer Seiler, and he actually rode on horseback up to the Minford house through all the snow to bring 1 gallon of milk so that I would have milk to drink. Now, this is a photograph of my dad's mom, Ma Stella. Now, Ma Stella was a pretty strict school teacher. She never smiled she was not a lot of fun. Ma Jones in the middle, her maiden name was Richardson, and Gagey was a Richardson, the one on the right. They were both a lot of fun. Those two on the right were tremendous amounts of fun. They used to play pranks and do all kinds of stuff. Their greatest prank that everybody always talked about, back in the 1930s, both Gagey and Ma lived in West Elizabeth, down next to the river. And they all went to the West Elizabeth Methodist Church. One night, the Methodist men were having a meeting in the bottom of the church, and Gagey and Ma decided to have some fun. So they got dressed up. They put a white sheet over their head, cut some holes in it, got men's shoes, and they took a $1 bill, which was a lot of money in those days, and they actually, in the very middle of the Methodist men meeting, they walked into the church, walked up to the altar of the church, laid down $1 bill, turned around and walked out without saying a word. No one knew who it was. Everyone thought that the Ku Klux Klan had come to the Methodist men meeting. And the minister even said, "Thank you, sir," when they put the $1 down. Well, then Gagey and Ma got scared because next day there was all kinds of rumors that the Ku Klux Klan had showed up in a big Cadillac limousine, and there were all kinds of, well, then they got afraid, so they swore that they would never tell anybody that it was them that showed up at the West Elizabeth Methodist Church. And it was years later before anybody found out that it was both of them. Now, if you notice, Ma and Gagey are both dressed up in sort of old clothes. They were going along with Ma Stella to the celebration in Frostburg. Now, Frostburg is where Gagey and Ma grew up. Most of her side of the family is all from Frostburg, Maryland. Now, there's a little bit of a confusion here. Most all of the birthdays and dates and everything talks about Eckert, Maryland. Yet, I'd never been to Eckert, Maryland in my life, and all the relatives and everybody was always from Frostburg. So I don't know if they changed the name of Eckert to Frostburg or what, but Frostburg was where I remember because we used to go there all the time with Ma and Gagey. This is a picture, it has to be 1953. This was in Dean Minford's house on Pleasant Hills on Route 51. And what they did on this one was, it was Christmas time, obviously, and there was a man who worked with my Lon Jones, who he would dress up in Santa Claus and then go to a house, and then the parents left a bag of toys outside in the porch. And this guy would come up onto the porch, take the bag of toys, knock on the door and come in, and he would give the child the toys. Well, the child thought that Santa Claus was bringing the toys in. So as you can see on here, I'm white as a ghost because I was so scared when Santa Claus showed up to give me all of his toys. And you can see that there's a piano there. Darlene had a piano. Darlene played the piano. Ma Stella played the piano. And Lon Jones was a famous piano player, organist. Okay, this is going in, again, this is out at Ma Stella's house, out at the farm. Looks like somebody's birthday here. That's Lon Jones. That's John, little kid in my mother's hands. My mother, there's me, Ma Jones, and then I don't know who's next to Ma Jones. I'm not quite sure on this. Let me give you a quick incidence of background of Lon Jones. Lon Jones basically came from Baltimore. He was in a group of 4 brothers. Their father, believe it or not, Lon was the youngest of the 4 brothers. He was born very late in life because Lon's father fought in the Civil War. And he was actually injured in the Civil War. And because of his injury, he came and was put in a nursing home for the federal government for Union soldiers in Wheeling, West Virginia. So they came from Wheeling and they came to West Virginia. Lon Jones's mother ran the hotel in Elizabeth, PA, and that's where Lon then grew up. Also, Lon had a brother named Wilford. Now, Wilford was the only one of Lon's brothers that I ever knew. He was blinded when he was a young child. He had a job in Baltimore, and his job was to go around with like a little candle kind of a thing, and they used to have gas lights on the street, and they didn't have electric lights. They had a gas light, and so somebody had to go over and open up the little glass door, take this candle, and light the gas light for the evening. And he would go around and light so many gas lights every night. Well, one night there was gas that got in there, and when he opened up the door and put the candle in, it exploded, and glass fell down into his eyes. So Wilford was blinded for the rest of his life. And it's one of the reasons that the mother came to Pittsburgh, because he went to a blind school to try to teach him in Pittsburgh. And he had a musical talent. He became a piano tuner. He spent the rest of his life going all around tuning people's piano because he didn't need sight. He could just listen to the piano. So that was Wilford Jones. Also, there is supposed to be a story that I've always heard that Lon Jones was related somehow to Revolutionary War General Anthony Wayne. And Anthony Wayne, of course, that would mean that if that's true, if one of the Lon Jones's family came from Anthony Wayne, that we would be able to join the sons and daughters of the American Revolution. And I was always pushing my mother to join this, but for some reason or other, my mother never really seemed interested in it. Now, I say that's unusual because you'll see later on when Ann Odge shows up in the picture. Now, Ann Odge, who was a friend of my mother from college, and so we just called her Aunt Odge. Remember, we didn't have any aunts or uncles or cousins, so we got to pick our aunts. So Aunt Odge was just a college friend of my mother. She was an old maid from Cleveland, and she would come for a lot of the holidays and spend with us. But Aunt Odge was a member of the DAR. Okay, we're sort of changing a little bit here. This is where I currently live. And if anybody's been here to see me recently, you'll be amazed because there's no trees. When I brought this 20-acre piece of property, there was not a single tree on it because it was all cornfields. The farmer had plowed all the cornfields. So, for instance, you cannot see this right now because there's huge trees blocking your view. But and that's when we used to have 2 ponds. We had ponds, and the fish in the pond came from Sam Manarino's pond. We got them from Sam Manarino. So we had a lot of fish. I actually used to go down and feed the fish. But then at some point in time, whenever we got little kids, I had the ponds drained because I was afraid little kids would go down and fall in them, and I didn't want the responsibility. And after that, they never held water. By the way, this is 2020, and that blazer that's there, I still have it. It's out in the barn. Okay, now this is an interesting picture. This is Ma Jones and Gagey. Now, I'm guessing they're probably in their 20s. Ma Jones is to the left, and Gagey is standing to the right. Now, remember, they both came from Frostburg, Maryland. Lon Jones somehow met Alberta Jones, and he would go visit her in Frostburg. Now, Lon Jones had a best friend from West Elizabeth by the name of Art Byers. So Art Byers used to ride the train with him just to go to Frostburg, just to keep my grandfather company. Well, when they got to Frostburg, Art Byers started hanging around with Alberta's younger sister named Gertrude, and they ended up getting married. An interesting thing, when Art Byers and Gertrude Richardson got married, they got married on a Saturday, and after the wedding ceremony, they all got into buckboards pulled by horses and went out to a park someplace, the whole family, and they had a big picnic. Then they come back home that night. That picnic was considered their honeymoon. And next Monday, Art Byers went back to work. So that's constituted a honeymoon, was just a picnic in the afternoon with all the family present. Okay, this is a young picture of Lon Jones to the left and Alberta to the right. I can't tell you how much fun Alberta was. She was just a character. She was always telling stories and laughing and doing pranks, and she would oftentimes, when I would be out at the farm, out at Ma's house, she would call up and she would have Gagey, who just lived next door. She'd have Gagey go down over the hill, dress up like a tramp and then have Gagey walk up the hill while I'm playing by myself outside, and then Ma's watching me through the window. And this tramp tried to catch me and to grab me, and I started yelling and screaming, and Ma thought that was the funniest thing, having Gagey try to catch me pretending to be a tramp. Now, Lon Jones was tremendous in music, as I said. He played in the silent pictures. All through the 20s, he had his own dance band group, and because he played the organ or the piano. And there's a cute story when Lon Jones got into the Second World War. He used to take his group, and they would go down to play at Carnegie Mellon and Pitt on weekends for fraternities and different social gatherings. Well, when World War II started, he couldn't get enough gasoline because it was rationed to go down to Oakland on the weekend. So at this time in 1941, 1942, Dean and Darlene were dating each other, and Dean was Jim Minford's son, and Jim Minford was the civil defense warden of Clairton. So Jim Minford, to give Lon Jones enough money or enough gasoline to get to Oakland, gave him the job of civil defense aircraft spotter. Now let's give you a quick little story on this. Lon and Bertie used to live in West Elizabeth, down right next to the river. And every year the river would come up because there were no dams on the Monongahela River back in the 1930s. So every single year, Lon and Bertie's house would be flooded. And every single year, Lon and Bertie had to take all their furniture up to the second story, and then they had to rip out plaster and had to repaint everything. So Lon Jones got really tired of this. So he decided that he's going to build a house. There was a new community just down the river from West Elizabeth called Clairton. Now, Clairton was built on a bluff way up above the river. So Lon Jones decided he's moving from West Elizabeth to Clairton. So he goes down and he takes all of his money out of the West Elizabeth Bank. And all of his family members from West Elizabeth said, "Oh, Lon, don't take your money out. You've got a lot of money in the bank. You're making all this interest on it, and you don't want to lose that interest, so just stay here in West Virginia." Lon says, "No, I'm tired of being flooded out." That's it. So in May of 1929, Lon Jones pulls all the money out of the bank and goes up and buys a house on Clairton up above on the hill above the river. In November of 1929, the stock market crash comes. The West Elizabeth Bank closed its doors, never to reopen again, And everyone that had money in the West Elizabeth Bank lost everything, except Lon Jones, who had pulled it out 6 months ahead of time. So he lucked out on that particular deal. Okay, Roseanne Richardson and Darlene. So this has to be like around 1930, because I think Roseanne Richardson, that's Darlene's grandmother. Roseanne Richardson had 10 children, of which Gagey and Ma were the two youngest. And Roseanne Richardson came to live with Lon and Bertie in West Elizabeth. Darlene, who was my mother, she was a rather spoiled child because Lon and Bertie had a child around 1910 named Lorena. Now you'll see pictures of Lorena later on. Lorena died at age 12 from juvenile diabetes. She basically starved to death. She couldn't get enough food to eat. So at age 12, she starved to death, and everyone was always so sad because she died 6 months before insulin came on the market. So if she'd lived 6 more months, she could have taken insulin and probably had a normal life. So when Lorena died at age 12, Lorena was very talented. She sang, she danced, she did all kinds of skits. She was very, very popular. And when Lorena passed away, they closed the West Elizabeth School so that all of the school kids could go to the funeral. Now, this is Ma Jones is on the right, and Darlene Minford is on the left. I'm guessing Darlene is 2 years old, probably. Now, you can see by the old houses in the background that this is probably in the yard of the house where Joneses lived in down next to the river, the one that always flooded out. So when Lorena passed away, which was their first child, the Joneses had no children for about 5 or 6 years. And when Darlene then came 5 years later, her parents considered her a gift from God. And Darlene could basically do no wrong, which made for a tough personality later on because Darlene was always used to getting her own way. Anything she wanted to do, they gave it to her because they were so pleased about having Darlene. Another interesting little tidbit on this was when Lorena passed away, she was very, very weak, and Lorena said to her mother, Ma, wouldn't it be terrible if I go to heaven and you don't get to go to heaven whenever you die? So that's when Ma became extremely religious, and she really became a religious fanatic because she wanted to be able to go see Lorena whenever Ma passed away, because Lorena asked her to do that. Now, this is Lorena. I'm guessing she's 2 years old. This is in the house down next to the river. Very popular little kid, very nice, but she was born with diabetes, and in those days, juvenile diabetes was a death sentence for anybody. Hardly anyone lived into their 20s if you had juvenile diabetes because you just couldn't get enough food. When she passed away at age 12, I think she was 50 pounds, which is quite small. This is Lorena Jones, again, down by the house, down by the river. When she was a little child, she was very precious and really just beloved by her parents. This is Roseanne McDonald. Now, that was Ma Jones's mother, and that is Grandma Powell. And to the right, Grandma Powell, which was the mother of Roseanne Richardson. The problem with it gets confusing because we call her Grandma Powell. Now, I never met her, but everybody called her Grandma Powell, but she probably should have been called Grandma Richardson because the Richardson dad died in a coal mine accident, and Mrs. Richardson got remarried to a man named Powell. So, but Powell is not he's not related to the family, but those are the mother and daughter, Grandma Powell and Roseanne Richardson. Another picture of Darlene. That's Ma Jones to the left, Darlene in the middle, Lon Jones in the right. I mean, Lon Jones, always remember Lon Jones wearing a suit because he wore a suit every day because he was in charge of the accounting department. in the steel mills of Clairton, and also the coal byproducts plant, which was in Clairton. Notice Darlene's dress. That's an interesting pattern. Lon Jones, in these days, and this is probably, it had to be taken in the 1930s. In these days, Lon Jones would go to work every morning carrying a white shirt on a coat hanger. He would wear a white shirt and he would carry a white shirt because the Clairton steel mill and coal byproducts plant, which was right next to where his office was for the accounting department, was so dirty and there was so much pollution in the air that by 12 o'clock noon, his collar and his sleeves were coal black. So he used to take his first shirt off at noontime, put on a clean shirt for the rest of the day, because that's how much pollution and stuff. So when people talk about pollution today, they have no idea. Grandma Jones, she used to wear a gauze mask when she went to downtown Pittsburgh because you didn't want to breathe the air because it was so dark, so full of pollution. Darlene Minford, I'm not sure where this was taken up. It looks like when Darlene in college. Darlene graduated from high school in 1940, along with 1941, along with Dean. They both graduated from Clairton High School. Dean went to Carnegie Mellon. Darlene went to Grove City. Darlene was not happy with Grove City. Grove City was a very conservative religious school, and that was the only school that Darlene's parents would send her to. In 1944, Darlene got married to Dean Minford, and as soon as she got married, the first thing she did was transfer to Denison College in Ohio. It was much more to Darlene's liking because it was much more of a fun school, party school. They were allowed to drink, so she liked that much better. Also, there were a lot of wealthy girls from Cleveland that came to Denison, and that's where she met Aunt Auge Carlton, who was her friend for the rest of her life. I never remember Darlene, my mom, ever talking about Grove City hardly at all. I mean, she never had any friends from Grove City, but she only spent 1 year at Denison, and that's all we ever heard about. Denison did this, Denison did that. And of course, Darlene has furs on here. If you'll notice, there's a lot of pictures, and it's oftentimes Darlene is the only person who wears a fur because Darlene liked to dress really, really nice. Now, this was taken out at my house where I grew up on Clarendon Avenue in Lower Borough. That's Ma Jones to the left. Franklin Barber is next. Annie Winklevoss, then John, and my mother. Now, you remember, Annie Winklevoss was a relation to my grandfather Minford. Remember, that's how grandfather Minford met Stella, was when Annie Winklevoss was in the 4th grade doing a little play. Now, the man here, Franklin Barber, who was a real sweetheart, a great guy, he was the ubiquitous salesman. He could sell anything to anybody. He had jokes and stories to just tell you nonstop, and they were all just fantastic. A cute story with Franklin Barber. Now, Franklin Barber went to college at California State in Pennsylvania, as did Ma Stella went to college at California State. So it's very unusual to have two people in the same family back in 1910 go to college. Uncle Frank went to college. World War II came around, and he went down to take his draft physical. When he got his draft physical, he got his chart back, and it had a big red eye on the outside of it. So he was sent out to the Great Lakes Naval Training for the Navy, and he checked into this base, and all of a sudden he discovered that this big red eye stood for illiterate. In other words, they thought he couldn't read and write. Well, when they found that he was actually a college graduate, they said, "Oh, great, you'll stay here and help teach the illiterate guys." So all the illiterate people had to come to this Great Lakes Naval Training. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. The first thing Uncle Frank used to have to do was to teach them how to make a sign for their paycheck so they could get their cash on their paycheck. Also, Uncle Frank would have to read all the guys their letters because they couldn't read. And a lot of the letters were Dear John letters, like their girlfriend just decided to go with Uncle Billy and she dropped. And these guys would say, I'm going home. I can't stay. Susie's going to leave me. And Uncle Frank would be grabbing this guy by the belt. You can't leave. This is the military. You can't just walk out the gate and go home. You can't do that. And so he was there for a long time training and teaching these soldiers how to read and write. After a while, Uncle Frank went up to his commanding officer and said, I can't take this anymore. Please, I'm begging you, send me to combat. I want to go to combat. I can't, I'm going to lose my mind with all these guys. So Uncle Frank ended up being a radio operator on a destroyer. Annie Winklevoss. Annie was a really nice person. I used to know her real well. She'd been up to my house here. She lived down near 84, Pennsylvania. That's where basically all her family was from. But she would come up at Christmas time to visit us here and come visit on Clarendon Avenue in Lower Borough. But she was similar to Aunt Audge. And, since we didn't have a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins, we would pick these people. And she would always she was a great, just a really nice, great person. But she's related to Jim Minford. Now, here's Aunt Audge. Aunt Audge was a sweetheart if there ever was one. An old maid, never got married. Her father was a big banker in Cleveland. He did a lot of international banking. They had a tremendous amount of money. I'm sure Darlene liked that. But Aunt Audge would always come to our house for Christmas and Thanksgiving and in the summertime. And her whole life, she always came to visit us. And a number of years later, then when Aunt Audge passed away, Kathy went up to Cleveland where the funeral was, and we went to the funeral, and all of the friends and relatives from up in Cleveland were so excited to see Kathy and I, because I guess Aunt Audge, for all these years, had always told them all about the wonderful time she had in Pittsburgh with her friends in Pittsburgh. And so everybody was so anxious to see who the friends in Pittsburgh were. And that's where I made a big mistake. When the funeral was over, the attorney that was handling the estate, now remember, Aunt Audge's dad was very wealthy, and so the attorney said, listen, go down to Aunt Audge's house, take anything you want. Now, she had antique furniture like you wouldn't believe. You know what, Kath and I, we wanted to get home, so we didn't go. Boy, that was a dumb move on our part. Aunt Audge had all kinds of stuff. This is Mom in the house on Clarendon Avenue. That's typical Darlene. She always liked to look good. It was always interesting to me. I never really understood how Dad and Mom stayed together, because Mom was an only child and spoiled, and my dad was an only child and spoiled. So that really made for a bad situation. Most of my life growing up, I never saw my dad. He was entirely down in the basement. Dad had set himself up a project that he was going to copy on tape all of the music ever made on planet Earth. And I kept saying, Dad, they're making music faster than you can record it. No. And he was going to, and then he was going to sell this tape with all this music on it for a tremendous amount of money when he retired. And I kept saying, Dad, aren't you going to have problems with copyright and stuff selling somebody's music? No, that didn't apply to Dad. Now, you have to understand, I'll give you a quick synopsis here. Dad was very intelligent. Now, Dad was a PhD in biochemistry, but he didn't have the common sense that God gave a duck. I mean, when it came to common sense stuff, a classic example in this house on Clarendon Avenue. We moved up there in 1954 from Pleasant Hills, and we had a yard for the first time, because in Pleasant Hills, our yard was a postage stamp, and you just had to push more than you had to push it. So this up at Clarendon Avenue, we got a gas lawnmower. So Dad got a gas lawnmower, and after about a month, it didn't run. Couldn't get the darn thing to start. So he went out and bought a new lawnmower. In 1 month, he bought a new lawnmower. And so he said he wanted me to cut the grass. So I went down and I was going to cut the grass, and he came down in the garage and he's got, Jim, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're going to ruin my lawnmower. You're going to ruin. And I said, gee, no, Dad, I'm just doing what it said. I'm reading the directions on the gas tank. It said, put a half pint of oil in with a gallon of gasoline and mix it all up. Well, that's why the first lawnmower didn't work. It was a 2-cycle engine, and Dad never put any oil in the gas. So he just burned it up. So the lawnmower burned up, but he's yelling at me for doing it wrong, and I was the one that was doing it right. Also, it's interesting when Pop-Pop Jim died. Now remember, he had a Studebaker dealership, and he had unbelievable sets of tools. And so when he passed away, all the tools went to me because I used to go and work with my Pop-Pop Jim, and he knew I loved pools and would take care of them. He didn't give any tools to his own son, who he knew was a klutz. So all the tools were given to me, and in my house, I kept all the good tools in a big chest under lock and key, and I wouldn't let my dad have any of them. If he wanted something, I'd give him, I had a little handy-andy toolkit with a little hammer and a saw and a pair of crummy pliers. That's all my dad could use. I wouldn't give him any of the good stuff. Okay, this is Darlene and her mother, Ma. Ma was just a really nice person. Very religious, but she was just a lot of fun. She lived out in Jamestown Manor here after everyone passed away out in Clairton. And she and Darlene, sometimes they didn't get along so well. Ma didn't believe in drinking, and Darlene would have a beer or a glass of, actually in Hilton Head, Darlene would have a glass of, that was another one of the funny things. At Hilton Head, when they lived down Hilton Head, of course, Ma was gone by this time, Darlene would call Dean. She would say, Dean, on the intercom, it's 5 o'clock, time for my scotch. And my mother had a glass of scotch every day at 5 o'clock, and my dad had to come and have one with her because Mom wouldn't drink by herself. So my dad would go grouchy, would slouch all over and go over and sit down and have a glass of scotch, which he really didn't like. But it was also interesting, too, that my dad would never drink in front of Ma Jones. Never. He would sneak it behind her, keep it down in the basement or something like that, but he never wanted to. And actually, I used to get in big fights not fights, but discussions with my grandmother Jones about whether Jesus ever drank wine. Grandma Jones said, no way, Jesus never drank wine. And I said, but Grandma, even if you put grape juice in a jug, after 48 hours, that grape juice is turning into wine. You can't really, there's no really way to stop it. No, Jesus only drank grape juice. Okay, Grandma, whatever you say. Now, this is on the left-hand side. This is Karen Williams. Karen Williams Laufer is her married name. She was, Williams was her maiden name. That's her son, Eric, and that's Ma Jones. Now, this was probably the only person in our family that I ever palled around with. I was Ma Jones's grandson. Karen Williams was Aunt Gagy's granddaughter. Gaggy had one daughter named Sarah Louise, and this was Sarah Louise's only daughter. So once again, this family only had one child. So there wasn't a lot of kids in our family. But Karen was a year or two older than us. And since Gaggy lived right next door to Ma Jones, well, then when Karen would come up, Karen and I would play all the time and just go around together and explore and everything. And Karen now lives down in outside of Washington, not too far from John. Eric, the little boy here, he went down to Hilton Head with Karen and George Laufer. They went down to visit Mom and Dad at Hilton Head, and I probably shouldn't mention this, but I can't help it. When my dad came home from World War II, he brought two beautiful Japanese samurai swords, and he was showing these at Hilton Head to this little Eric, who was maybe 15, 16 at the time. Well, quote, Eric asked if he could borrow these two samurai swords, and Dad made a mistake and said, well, sure. So Karen and George and Eric, they took the two samurai swords, and guess what? That's the last we ever saw of those babies. I'd like to have them back because I'm sure Connor would really like to have a samurai sword, but those are beautiful samurai swords. Okay, this is down at Hilton Head. This is me and Megan and Kathy and Poppy Dean. Now, Dean went by the name of Poppy Dean, and my mother went by the name of Nana Darlene. But we had a lot of fun down at Hilton Head. The story for how we got to Hilton Head is somewhat interesting. How we got to Hilton Head, Mom decided one day, Connor was in medical school. I was out of dental school practicing in Lower Borough, and Darlene saw an ad in the newspaper for a timeshare. So she thought it might be nice to have a timeshare. So she went down, made arrangements. You went down to Hilton Head and you spent like 3 days in this timeshare, and then they showed you around about getting you to buy one. So we were in this timeshare, and once we got there, Darlene just fell in love with it, all the people and everything. So Darlene went out and started to see a real estate agent. And lo and behold, Dean and Darlene decided they wanted to buy a house down there, not a timeshare. No, so they ended up buying a house, of which it was supposed to be 1/3 mine. But what I can tell you, for example, is don't ever go into partnership with your parents. That's a bad move, because you'll never be an equal partner, because I was never allowed to use the house. I didn't clean the house. My friends couldn't come visit. I mean, this was a real losing situation as far as I was concerned. But anyhow, that's how we got the house in Hilton Head. And Mom and Dad lived there for 30 years. Mom's best friend was Frederick Bristol from Bristol and Myers. She would go down the road to Bristol's house and play backgammon with Frederick Bristol every day. And she thought that was just so great that she was playing with Frederick Bristol. Okay, go to next. Okay, this is a picture sort of out of line with the other photographs, but these are something that I take very seriously, and I really enjoyed this. These were my 3 chickens that I had: Spike, Mike, and Darkwing. These were chickens that my daughter Megan had at a science project at the elementary school. And when chickens hatched, well, then they needed to do something with the chickens. So I said I'd take them because my garden was all fenced in. So I brought the 3 chickens out, and for a whole year I had these 3 chickens. And I loved them, and they really loved me. Now, this is one picture that I really feel bad that I don't have. Every day I would go over to feed Spike, Mike, and Darkwing, because that's Darkwing's black. And I would sit down to feed the chickens. One chicken would hop up on my thigh, that would then hop up on my shoulder, and then hop up on my head. The other 2 chickens would hop up on my 2 thighs and hop up on my 2 shoulders. So I could actually stand and walk around the garden with the chicken on my head and a chicken on each shoulder. And I could just walk around, and the chickens were very comfortable. They sat down there and they just watched everything. I really like Spike, Mike, and Darkwing. Okay, can't read this but a little bit, but this is Darlene Jones' wedding announcement. This was an interesting one. Darlene got married in 1944. Now, in 1944, Dad was already in the United States Navy, and he was training to be a communications officer. He was a lieutenant, JG lieutenant, junior grade. And he got married, Dean and Darlene got married in Clairton, Pennsylvania. And what is interesting, now Darlene's maid of honor was Sarah Ralph. Now, a lot of you here will know Max and Sarah Ralph. That were 2 of Dean and Darlene's best friends all through their life. They later on in life went on cruises with Mom and Dad, and on the 50th wedding anniversary cruise, Max and Sarah came along, but they always went everywhere with Mom and Dad. Now, so Sarah Ralph was Mom's maid of honor. Dad, to this day, has no idea who his best man was or who the ushers were. Because if you think about it, in 1944, all of Dad's high school friends or college friends were in the military and were either in Europe or in the Pacific. So there was no one in Clairton that Dean knew to be his best man and ushers. What they did was, there were a group of men, a dozen or so men, who failed to pass the draft physical. So they were not able to be in the war. And as part of their patriotic duty, they then volunteered to be the ushers and the best men. So these group of 12 people, they would be the ushers and best men at every wedding every week, because the guys that were all gone, so these guys all did it. So to this day, Dad has no idea who his best man or who his ushers were. Also, when Dean and Darlene got married on Saturday, Right after Saturday, they went on a honeymoon. Their honeymoon, they took the train to Harrisburg, and Harrisburg, they spent one day, and they came back Monday morning. That was their honeymoon. One day in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Not actually the greatest place in the world for a honeymoon. Then Dean went over to the Pacific, and Darlene went back to Denison College. This was a picture on the cruise ship when Dean and Darlene had their 50th wedding anniversary. I'll go through the people standing far left. That's Robert Minford, Terry Minford, Max Ralph, Sarah Ralph. I think that's Kathy. And in front of Kathy on the far right, I'm on the far right. Darlene is next to me, and Dean and Rachel Minford, that's John Minford's daughter, is right next to him, and that's John Minford. So that's the first picture of Max and Sarah Ralph, Dean and Darlene's best friends all through life. This was a cruise we went on through the Panama Canal. It was a very, very nice cruise. Of course, I was big on cruises. I think I've been on 13 cruises, and they're really good. But this was a nice time. Notice Dean's jacket. Interesting, I had a Paisley jacket that I got in high school back in 1965 or 66. And Paisley was in it in 1965. Then Paisley was out, so I didn't wear the jacket for probably 15 or 20 years. My dad came up one time, and he saw this Paisley jacket. He said, "Really, gee, Jim, this jacket's really nice." So I said, "You can have it, Dad." So he took my Paisley jacket, and this was yellow and orange and red and Paisley. He ended up wearing that Paisley jacket for the rest of his life. He loved it. Okay, this is my family. That's Connor to the far right, Kathy, myself, and then Megan. We basically all lived here in Lower Burl our whole life. And the kids are really cute. We have a lot of fun with them. Okay, this is Poppy Dean with his dog Gretchen. Gretchen, Mom and Dad always had dachshunds. And I think they had 3 dachshunds, Bernie, Max, and Gretchen. And they just dearly loved their dogs. And as a matter of fact, the last dog they had was Gretchen. And when Mom first found out she had cancer, Dad, as a gift, went out and got her another dachshund, Gretchen. And so Gretchen stayed with Darlene for the rest of her life. And Dean and Darlene always argued about who Gretchen liked the best, whether he liked Dean or he liked Darlene. And that was a standing argument between the two of them. Well, Darlene passed away, and then Dad was down with Gretchen for a number of years. And when Gretchen passed away, Dad had Gretchen cremated, which is unusual. You don't normally have a dog cremated. Well, he had Gretchen cremated, and one of the last things that Dad did when he was 93 at the nursing home, he got me aside and he made me promise that when he passed away, he wanted to be cremated, and he wanted me to pour Gretchen's ashes into his cremation jar with him, so that he wanted to have Gretchen with him for all eternity. And I thought that was a little tacky myself, and in all honesty, I didn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to opening Dad's jar and opening Gretchen's and dumping Gretchen in and closing. I just didn't. So I hope we get Dad back down to the plot down at Hilton Head, because we were having trouble getting Dad down there. I think Dad's still down at Uncle John's house. Okay, this is John and Terry. I remember I said he was Kent up until he was 18 years old. He went away to college at Rutgers and came home and decided that he wanted to go with John from that time on, which that was okay. John was a very intelligent guy, very smart. He skipped his senior year in college, went right from his junior year to medical school, which was a nice thing to be able to to do, but one of the stories that I always remember now, when he went to Rutgers, I always had to go pick him up and drop him off because he stayed in the Delta Upsilon fraternity house. So I would go take him out and I would go bring him back home. I always had to do that because had my mother seen the squalor in which he was living, she would have pulled him out of college and brought him home and never let him go back. So I had to always go there and pick him up. And one of the stories, his freshman year, he had a kid on his floor, a football player named Dennis Logan. And Dennis was a real nice, fun guy. So Dennis wanted to take John up to New York City, where Dennis was from. So John and Dennis on a weekend go up to New York City, and they're going all around. And Dennis they stop off at this bar, and John was really impressed because John's sitting in this bar, and people kept coming over, and strangers would go up and buy him drinks and this and that. And time after time, he had all these free drinks, and he says to Dennis, he said, wow, these people, they are really, really nice. So whenever Dennis and John left, Dennis got out in the street and he said, well, you do know that's a gay bar, right? He took them to a gay bar just so they got free liquor. Then John met Terry, and Terry went to medical school with John, I guess it was his residency maybe. I think it was his residency. And Terry thought that John was arrogant and stuff because John was pretty arrogant and stuff. So Terry didn't like him at first. She had to learn to like him. Terry's a great person. Her mom and dad are great people. Her dad Nate used to make these stained glass pictures that were absolutely scrumptious. I mean, he made me a stained glass of a P-51 that is just tremendous. Okay, this is a picture of Kathy Minford. We had to take a little pause here with the director because I wasn't sure who this was. But this is actually a picture of Kathy. Obviously before I knew her, because she didn't look like that whenever she worked down at the bank when I knew her. But this is an early picture of Kathy. Still very, very pretty. She's one of the most beautiful women that I know. Just really spectacular. Kathy Minford is the standard upon which all other wives are compared with unsuccessfully. I tell that to her all the time. That's a standard joke with me. Another picture of Kathy. When she sees this picture, she's going to be really upset with me for including this. She doesn't like these early pictures with the long hair. Another, probably a high school picture. Okay, Dean and Darlene on a cruise. They went out to see Devil's Island on their cruise. I got them started in cruises, but boy, once I got them started in cruises, they couldn't be stopped. They were cruising everywhere. I remember Mom went on a cruise with Sarah Ralph where they started in Germany and went all the way around Gibraltar and all the way around Spain and ended up in Italy. And another time they started in Italy and they went through this Suez Canal and went all the way over to Kuala Lumpur in Singapore, right over by Singapore. But they loved to go. Now, what they used to do, they were on what was known as a short list. They could go on a cruise with 1 week's notice. So they kept their suitcase bags packed all the time. And then if a cruise ship line wasn't able to fill the ship, they would call Mom and Dad up and charge them only one half. Well, then Mom and Dad would go. So they kept suitcases all the time so they could go within 1 week, and they had all their passports and everything. Now, this is Dad with his music. Remember I said before that Dad wanted to tape every bit of music ever written, and I told him he was going to have some problems, but no, he didn't see any problems. And so he taped all of the rock and roll music, which I used to really love. Well, then I used to steal my dad's 8-track tapes with all the rock and roll music because he had every rock and roll song known to man on these tapes. So I would play these tapes, and after a while, I'm listening to these songs, and they didn't sound right. It didn't sound like you heard on the radio or anything like that. So all of a sudden, I realized that in order to save tape, Dad was only taping on one track on his reel-to-reel tapes. Well, a lot of these records were stereo. So if it was a stereo record and Dad only taped on one track, he would only get half of the song. So, and I didn't have the heart to tell Dad that he had taped all these songs and they were all no good because he'd only taped one track and didn't have the other one. Oh, there's Nana Darlene down at Hilton Head with Gretchen. Now that's Maxie there. Interesting bit of trivia. Max would sleep with Nana Darlene, and Max would sleep under the covers down at the bottom of the bed. This is up in Clarendon Avenue in Loughborough. When Dad would get up first to go to work, and when he's ready to leave, he would come in and get Mom up. When he would get Mom up, if he would sort of like shake her by the shoulder, under the covers, he'd hear this grrr. And next thing you see, this little dog's running out, chasing Dad. And he would actually chase Dad out of the room and down the hall because Max wouldn't sleep when Mom got up. He had to get up too. And Max didn't want to get up, so he would be desperate to try to keep Nana Darlene sleeping as long as she possibly could. Okay, this is Rachel and Megan. The cute story on this one was Rachel is 2 years older than Megan. So when Megan was 5, Rachel was 7. And the interesting story was Rachel and Megan both lost their same tooth on the same week, even though there was 2 years difference in their age. Rachel went down to University of West Virginia and did very well in the equestrian. She was on the equestrian team down there. She rode horse. Of course, it was helpful the fact that her dad and mom had a horse farm and they boarded horses. They usually had about a dozen horses at their house. So that was always helpful. And talking about out at the horse farm, one time we went out with Connor and it was the same day that John and Terry were getting a truckload of bales of hay. They must have had 100 bales of hay to come to put up in the top of the barn. Well, Connor decided to help, and I helped, and John helped. But unfortunately, that I hadn't thought of, Connor's allergic to stuff. And he got so allergic, his whole face and hands, everything just swelled up. I was afraid we were going to have to take him to the hospital. Luckily, John and Terry had a lot of Benadryl, and they pumped Benadryl into Connor. But he really was sick with all the allergy to the hay. Here's Robert, Rachel's older brother. Robert was a really nice kid. He loved his video games. Robert is now a historian down in Richmond, Virginia, and he goes around to historical sites, finding out where they are, and so that no one destroys them. There's John and Rachel. They had a nice house down there in Baltimore. As I said, they have about 30 acres with a barn and all the horses and dogs and stuff. So it's quite nice. Terry was a physician, the same as John, but after a number of years, she decided that she liked taking care of the horses better. So she actually managed the horse farm. Now they made money by boarding horses. I don't know whether they made a profit or not, probably not, but they boarded a lot of horses. So people would board their horse in their farm and then come down to ride them on the weekends. Okay, Nana Darlene, Connor, and Megan. They were having fun. I'm pretty sure that's down at Hilton Head. I recognize but Nana Darlene just loved Hilton Head. She just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. She just loved it. I was never too crazy about it, but the problem with me was the fact that my mom and dad didn't know how to do anything. So every time I came down for a week or two, I spent the entire time working like a slave, fixing all the doors that didn't open and the cupboards that didn't open and the lawnmower that didn't run and the weed whacker that didn't run. And I had to do all these work that my dad couldn't do. I mean, and it was interesting because my dad, he grew up in a 4-bedroom apartment above the Studebaker dealership. So he was living up above a Studebaker garage. Now, if that would have been me when I was growing up, every day I'd have been down in a workshop watching guys changing spark plugs, changing tires, doing new brakes, and I'd have wanted to help them do stuff. I'd have learned how to do everything. My dad never wanted to. He didn't know how to do anything at all. I mean, it was just really amazing. He would never change an oil. He had a Peugeot one time that in probably 100,000 miles, he never changed the oil filter. So when I got to my driver's license, I wanted to take care of the car, so I pulled off the old oil filter, and it didn't have a paper, but it had a metal screen. Well, the metal screen was all caked with like a 1/4 inch of solid clay, and there was a hole where the pressure from the oil had exploded the wire because it was so clogged. But my dad, he would have a car that would sit there in diesel for 5 minutes, and I'd say, "Gee, Dad, I think you ought to go and get a tune-up." He said, "Oh no, it's a waste of money. I'm not going to let them rip me off and cheat me for that." The car's continuing to run even after he shuts it off. But that was just the way Dad did stuff. Okay, this is Megan, Robert, Connor, and Rachel. This was out at John's house. The kids had a lot of fun together. They all had a nice life. I wish we could have been closer and spent more time together, but that's one of the things that happened. But everybody had a good time. Okay, this is now again down at Hilton Head. This is Robert, Darlene, Dean, Megan, Rachel, and Connor down on the front steps of the Hilton Head house. I almost got eaten by an alligator down there, which is a story. In the backyard one time, it was an alligator out on the road, and I came out and I was looking at this alligator in the road, and I came out in the backyard until all of a sudden I heard a commotion behind me, and I turned around and there was a lagoon on the back of the yard. Here was this huge alligator trying to get out of the lagoon to come at me. He was no more than 10 feet away, and his little legs were moving as quickly as possible, but it was a steep bank, and he was sliding on the bank, and that was the noise I heard, with the rustling of his feet spinning and slipping. But he very well, if that had been level, he would have nailed me, not have been gone. Okay, this is getting into the good stuff now. This is Dean Minford in the Second World War. I'm considering that Dean fought for the United States. I'm really surprised that we won, because Dad was just not so good. Now, Dad went up to Harvard and was trained in an Acorn unit. An Acorn unit is the officers and staff that run an airfield. So they can go into just an empty airfield and take over and start running it. They have all the radar people, the communications people, the maintenance for planes, fueling, et cetera, et cetera. So Dad was in the Navy. He took over to Pearl Harbor. He went over in a liner, and at Pearl Harbor, they switched Dad and the Acorn unit into an LST. Now, an LST is a landing craft, but it's a big landing craft. And so they went all the way across the Pacific. And Dad said they went across the Pacific in this LST full of Blatt's beer. And Dad said to this day, he can never stand the taste or the smell of Blatt's beer, because all the officers and guys, they spent all day, because this LST only went 10 knots. They spent all day trying to sneak down in the hold and steal Blatt's beer from the cases down in the hold. However, Dad got over to 1945. Dad's LST got over to Okinawa. The United States had just won the Battle of Okinawa, and there were 5 LSTs. Dad was in one of the LSTs when they got notice that there was a typhoon coming. So the LSTs all went out of harbor, went out into the ocean, and was hit by this typhoon. Dad said his typhoon steamed full speed into the typhoon for 3 days, and at the end of 3 days, they were 90 miles behind where they started. So the typhoon had actually blown them backwards. He said the waves were so big that when this LST went up and down on the waves, the screws would come out of the water. And when the screws came out of the water, the whole ship would vibrate just wildly. Also, Dad was there. You couldn't get out of your bunk, so he had a bunk next to a porthole. He actually saw one of the LSTs was down in the trough of a wave. Another one of the LSTs was up on the top of the wave, and the one LST in the top came down right on top of the other LST, and they were both smashed and instantly went to the bottom of the ocean with all hands were lost. So they lost everybody on the 2 LSTs. So that was a pretty thing. That for 3 days, Dad said you had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. You just hung in a bunk, and that was all you could do. All the trucks and equipment and things that were up on the deck and were chained down when the typhoon was gone, all those trucks and stuff were washed overboard. Everything was gone. So now Dad gets up. The the peace treaty has been signed. So Dad goes up and into a Japanese naval base, the LST, 2 days after the peace treaty was signed. The Japanese have surrendered. The LST opens up, and this Acorn unit goes into a Japanese naval base up in northern Japan, and they noticed that there were still Japanese soldiers wandering around with rifles and pistols, and they weren't really sure whether the Japanese had got the word that the war was over, or they didn't know that the Japanese cared that the war was over. So they actually barricaded themselves in the control tower for 3 days, watching these Japanese soldiers walk back and forth across the deserted airfield until the Navy sent in a plane with a Marine Corps security detail. Now, he was in that airfield for just, maybe a month or so when they decided to close it down. This Acorn unit got transferred to Kizurazu Naval Station on Tokyo Bay. And this was the big Japanese naval base on Tokyo Bay. And Dad was in the community of a communications officer. And while he was there, they had the peace treaty was signed on the battleship Missouri. Now, everybody in the world wanted to come for the peace treaty to see it. So this airfield was entirely filled with planes. They had planes parked everywhere. And there were so many planes that they had to send some of the planes off to subsidiary airfields to park them there because there was not enough room in the main air base, Kizurazu. So after the peace treaty is over, Admiral Spruance, who was in charge of the Pacific Fleet at that time, wants to go back to Pearl Harbor, and he comes out to the airfield, and Dad and the other officers, nobody could remember where they sent Admiral Spruance's plane to park it. In other words, they couldn't find it. They knew it was around someplace, they didn't lose it, but they just weren't sure where it was. So that tends to make a 4-star admiral less than happy when you lose his 4-engine B-24 private plane. So they had to hunt around and hunt for his plane. So they hunted for Spruance's plane. They got it gassed up. It took off and went back to Pearl Harbor. The next week, Dad gets a message, report to Tokyo for disciplinary action court-martial. So my dad doesn't know what's going on, so he goes back into the MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, and there's this office, and he tell him that my dad is up for court-martialing. Apparently, it seems that when Spruance's plane left Tokyo, nobody bothered to inform Pearl Harbor that Spruance was coming in. So when the plane landed at Pearl Harbor, nobody knew it was landing, and Spruance had to walk across the airfield carrying his own bags. Well, 4-star admiral, they don't like to carry their own bags. So he was a little bit upset. And so he's going to court-martial the guy that didn't forward the message, alerting them that Spruance, because Spruance's plane would have gone down in the Pacific, nobody would have known he was missing. So Dad goes into this, they're having a preliminary court-martial, and Dad said that, well, Dad's airbase, Kizurazu, did not have a transmitter that would reach Pearl Harbor. So they were taking and sending the messages over to the Marine Corps Air Base on the other side of Tokyo Bay, who had a bigger transmitter, and they were sending the messages to Pearl Harbor. And that was the standard procedure that when Dad got there from after being up in the airfield up north. So Dad went in and told everybody this, and then he was told to go back to his station, and Dad was okay. And here they found out that when they sent the message over to the Marine Corps base, somebody misfiled the message, and it never got forwarded to Pearl Harbor. So Dad said within 2 days, the officer in charge of the Marine Corps communications disappeared. He was gone. So I said to Dad, well, Dad, whatever happened to that man? And Dad said, I don't know what happened, and I wasn't asking any questions. All I know was that I wasn't going to Portsmouth Naval Prison. That's all he cared about. Okay. Okay, this next photograph is in front of Lon Jones's house in Clairton. This is the house that he built up on top of the plateau in 1929. And this is a picture with, on the far right is Ma Jones. I don't know who the next one is. Standing in the front with the mink is Darlene. Naturally, you can always tell Darlene because she has either a mink or a fur coat on. No one else does. Standing behind her is her dad, Lon Jones. Standing over to the left was Stella Minford, and to the far right is Aunt Odge. Stella Minford, who was somewhat of a sour disposition, she and Darlene never got along well because Darlene wanted everything, and so Stella, she thought that her son Dean was being taken advantage of. So there was some bad feelings there between Darlene and Ma Stella. This is Gagey, then Ann Had, then Stella, then Ma Jones, and they're making apple butter at the farm. I remember this because I used to always help them. They basically every summer would gather up all the apples, and they had a great big copper kettle you can see there, and they would just, dozens of people would help paring and coring the apples, and they would actually make just gallons and gallons of apple butter. And then everybody would take so many things. So John was just asking me because he said he barely remembered this. And I said, I have a picture of them making apple butter out at the farm. This was in the backside of the farm down by the aluminum shed. Okay, this is me. I'm guessing me. So this is probably going to be close to 1949. It's Stella Minford, Lon Jones, and Bertie. They're at their house on Rose Avenue. That's where they lived in Clairton on Rose Avenue. Interesting bit of trivia on this. Now, Darlene lived up here too. So when Dean and Darlene were dating in high school, Dean would come up and pick Darlene up. And one day, Dean was to come up to pick Darlene up, and he was a little bit late. And he finally came up and knocked on the door. Darlene opened it, and Dean was in this sailor suit that was all dirty and had blood on it. And Dean had cuts, and they opened the door, and Dean said, he held up the steering wheel, and he said, "This is all that's left of my dad's truck." In coming up to Darlene's house, here, Jim had some kittens down at the store, and so Dean wanted to bring the kittens up to show them to Darlene. So he put the kittens in the front seat of the pickup truck, and he's driving down. Well, one of the kittens jumped down onto the floor of the pickup truck. So Dean bent over, picked up the kitten, and didn't look where he was going, and he ran straight into a telephone pole. Just totally destroyed the entire pickup truck. It's amazing Dean wasn't killed because there was just nothing left. And then Dean was afraid to tell his parents, so he stayed up at Darlene's house because his parents were out of town that weekend. When they got back home, they had to come up to Jones's to pick up Dean, and Dean was so afraid they were going to be mad. And Dean's dad said, "No, Dean, don't worry about the pickup truck. As long as you're okay, that's really all that matters. There's nothing else." So that was the end of the story. Now, years later, sitting out at the farm with Pop Jim, he told me the conclusion to the story, what wasn't told at the time. The conclusion to the story was that Jim had this pickup truck at the store, and it was a brand new pickup truck, and he forgot to put it on the insurance policy. So when this truck was destroyed, there was no insurance on it. So Jim Minford had to eat the whole cost of the wrecked pickup truck. Okay, this is Lon Jones, Dean Minford, Jim Minford, and Darlene. This is in front of Lon Jones's house on Rose Avenue in Clairton. I think I told you before about Lon Jones had to get more gasoline during the Second World War, so that he was assigned a job of aircraft spotter on a hilltop outside of Clairton. And he sat up there with a pair of binoculars and a metal civil defense helmet and an aircraft spotter handbook, and he had to keep a listing of all the planes that came over Clairton. And but because he had this aircraft spotter's job, he got extra gasoline, and then that enabled him to go in to Oakland to play at these fraternity parties and stuff with the dance band. Okay, this is Jamie. I'm guessing I'm about a year old. I'm being held by Lon Jones. Jim Minford is behind me. They said there's not many pictures of Jim Minford. And then Dean Minford is standing in front. Jim Minford, he grew up in a large house in Large. His dad was a superintendent of the Large coal mine. And I saw a picture of the superintendent's house. It was a massive house had porches all the way around, 360 degrees. And this was the house that Jim Minford grew up in. And so Jim Minford went to school, and he was in the Pittsburgh Academy. It was a military school in downtown Pittsburgh. And that's where he went to high school. So he went to military school. And he graduated in 1910, and he went to Penn State after that, graduated Penn State in 1915. Graduated from Penn State in 1914. And then things get very hazy, because after Jim Minford graduated, he had a job with the Department of Interior. He was a surveyor. He went down, and after he graduated, they went down with the U.S. government, and he surveyed the Miami beachfront area, which is Collins Avenue. And he said back in 1916 or 15, when he was down there, you could buy Miami beachfront property for 50 cents an acre. And we used to say, oh, Pop, Jim, God, why didn't you take $200 and buy 400 acres of Miami beachfront property? But he said, in those days, nobody ever thought you'd want Miami Beach, because it was all alligators and malaria and mosquitoes and swamps. And he says, but it was selling at 50 cents an acre. Okay, this is Pop Jim is on the left, Lon Jones is on the right. Notice Lon Jones always wore a vest. Don't know why, just liked it, I guess. And there's me in the middle. I'm not sure where this house is. So anyhow, Pop Jim, when he came back from being on a survey crew, he also had a job working for the Ledger Wood Paper Company in North Carolina, surveying for some of their wood trees and stuff that they had. So he worked there. But because he worked for the U.S. government and for Ledger Wood Paper Company, his parents back home said they didn't want him away because he was an only child. So they built him the Studebaker dealership. And so he came back to Clairton to run the Studebaker dealership. So 3 years out of college, he graduated college in 1914. By 1917, he's the owner and manager of a Studebaker dealership, which I saw the building. The building was unbelievably huge. I mean, it just was, as I said, then my dad lived on the 4-bedroom apartment on top of the dealership. And this is sort of interesting, I just found this recently on Ancestry.com. Jim Minford got drafted in World War I in 1917. So he was running the Studebaker garage. Well, when he got drafted, he needed somebody to run the garage. So he and Stella got married within like 2 weeks. And they got married just so she could manage the Studebaker dealership while he was away. So from 1917 to almost 1940, he ran the Studebaker dealership. He got tired of the Studebaker dealership because he was very proud of the fact that in Clairton, Pennsylvania, at this time frame, every physician, every attorney, every dentist, every steel mill official from the steel mill, everybody drove Studebakers. But they would only buy a Studebaker from Jim Minford. He had all these salesmen, but nobody wanted to deal with the salesman. They only wanted to deal with Jim, and he just got tired of it, having the pressure. He couldn't go anywhere, couldn't do anything. So in 1940, he sold the Studebaker dealership after 30-some years, and just stayed with the electric appliance store, General Electric Appliance Store. Now, as it turned out, this was a good deal because now let's think a second. So he has this General Electric appliance store. Now, in those days, the only way you could buy electric appliances was from the dealership. So Westinghouse had their own stores, General Electric had their own stores, Hot Point had their own stores, Maytag had there was no, you couldn't go to like a Kmart or a Walmart or something and buy all kinds of stores. So when World War II ended, Jim Minford basically had this electric appliance store, and he supplied everybody with electric appliances. Now, when all these soldiers came home from World War II, they all wanted to buy a house. And when they all wanted to buy a house, they all wanted to have washers and dryers and TVs and radios and electric mixers and stuff. So it was a dynamite time to be selling electric appliances at the end of World War II. Okay, this moves us down now to, this is Uncle Art Byers, Cora, that was Ma's sister, and that's Aunt Cora. Now, next to Aunt Cora is Irma Frankenberry, and on the far right is Charles Frankenberry. Charles and Irma was Aunt Cora's, one of her two daughters. Aunt Cora had two daughters, Polly and Irma. Now, Irma and Charles Frankenberry, he was a nice guy. He was a salesman. He's holding me on his lap, but I remember going down to Frostburg, and he was always a fun guy. He'd take me out on sales trips and stuff like that. So he was a really nice fella. But Irma and Polly were Aunt Cora's two kids. Now, this is probably one of the few pictures I'm not sure of. This is Grandma Powell, which means that's Maud Jones's grandmother, or Roseanne Richardson's mother. Now, if this is Darlene or is this Lorena, I'm not sure. I'm guessing Darlene, but I'm not positive. I know that Grandma Powell lived into the 1930s, so it could be either one. Okay, this is Jim Minford's graduation in 1910 from the Pittsburgh Academy. I've gone on the internet and tried to find anything about the Pittsburgh Academy. I cannot find anything at all. There's no website, no information about a Pittsburgh Academy. I'm thinking that Pittsburgh Academy might have turned into another private school, maybe Shadyside. So Shadyside might be what's from the Pittsburgh Academy, but there's no information on the internet on this. Now, another interesting bit that I'm not sure about is that I remember my dad distinctly telling me that Pop Jim was the top cadet in his class. So when that class would march someplace, Jim Minford would always march in front all by himself because he was the leader of the Corps of Cadets. Then I also found information on the Ancestry.com that said that Jim Minford, after being drafted, was sent to a military army camp in Kentucky where he was a private. Now, this is strange to me in that if somebody graduated from a military school, you wouldn't think the Army in World War I, who was so desperately short of officers, they had very few officers, you think that this would be officer material and you wouldn't make a private because he knew all about marching. I also remember Pop talking about field artillery. I thought that he told me that he was in field artillery, so I'm not sure exactly what happened. This is Pop Jim's house up on the farm. Interesting bit of trivia about Jim Minford. Jim and Stella lived here, and this house overlooked the valley where the coal mine was that Jim Minford grew up. In other words, the large coal mine is just over the valley from this house. Now, when Jim Minford left Large, he went down and they built the automobile garage in Clairton, and he spent 30 years living in Clairton until he moved back to this house in 1949, which is interesting in that Jim Minford spent his entire life inside a circle with a diameter of 4 miles, because from where he grew up in Large, it was 2 miles to Clairton, and this house here is 2 miles in the other direction. So basically, he lived in his entire life, all within 2 miles of each other. Another picture of myself and Karen Williams. Tom Williams took this photograph. Now, Tom Williams was a professional photographer. That's Karen's dad. Tom Williams' parents came out of West Elizabeth, and the same as the Byerses. As a matter of fact, Tom Williams' parents and the Byerses lived 4 houses apart down in West Elizabeth. Interesting bit about Tom, in the Second World War, they taught him how to be a photographer. So when the war ended, he came out and he got a job with West Penn Power. And at this time, West Penn Power was promoting, no, this was before the war. He had a job with West Penn Power. West Penn Power had these stores in every community on the Mon Valley, and these stores would showcase electric appliances because they wanted people to buy stoves and ranges and refrigerators and mangles. And so these West Penn Power stores would show you what you could do with an electric appliance. Now, these West Penn Power stores didn't really sell any electric appliances, but they showed you what they were. And then Tom Williams, his job was to go down and do the decorations in the windows for all of these stores for West Penn Power. Then obviously, after a while, West Penn Power stopped doing that. Now, this is James Briggs Minford. This is probably my oldest picture that I have. This is James Briggs Minford from 1893. This was a picture that I had. I don't even have any idea where I got this, but I know it was him. Okay, and then he basically went on to have the Studebaker dealership. Okay, this is Stella Minford. This is Stella Minford in 1914. So this was shortly before Jim married Stella. Remember, Stella was a elementary school teacher in the borough of Clareton, borough of Wilson. And Jim met her because of Annie Winklevoss doing a little play. So that's how he got to meet her. Okay, this was Jim Minford's race car. Now, Jim Minford was an interesting guy. So he'd done survey work in North Carolina for the Ledgerwood Paper Company. He'd done survey work for the U.S. government in Miami Beach. He had a dealership of Studebaker cars. I remember him telling me he also took flying lessons. There used to be an airport just down the road, and he took flying lessons right next to the old county airport. And he also had a race car. And this is the picture of Jim Minford in front of the Studebaker dealership, and this is his race car. And he was always very proud, he told me, because the guy that he had as a race car driver, later on in his career, he went on to drive at the Indy 500. And Pop-Up Jim also told me how that he remembers when he used a race car that they actually came up and drove the race car in New Kensington. That down where the Kmart is now on Trenham Bridge Road, that originally was a racetrack. And they would oftentimes come up here and race their car. Okay, this next picture is Dean Minford as a little child. And the woman next to him in the dark dress is Stella Minford. And next to Stella is Aunt Pline. And then the two crazy people next to Aunt Pline, I'm sure I don't know who they are. But this is sort of interesting to me because Stella was not really a fun person. So for her to be out with those two women on the right that are dancing and cutting up, it seems rather strange, but you can see how small Dean Minford is in this one. Okay, this is Karen Williams Laufer, and Sarah Louise is in the pink, and Tom Williams is in the right. Now, Sarah Louise was Gage's only child, and Tom Williams, I don't know if he had any brothers or sisters or not. Tom Williams ended up being the photographer for the Williamsburg restoration. So he would go down and anything that happened in Williamsburg, he was the official photographer. There's a cute story with this. When Tom Williams loved golf. So when Mom and Dad went to the Hilton Head house, they had the Harbortown golf tournament was there. And every year, Sarah Louise and Tom would come down to visit, because then they would go to the golf tournament and watch the golfers. Well, one day, Tom was walking by the clubhouse up at Harbortown, and he sees a sign that says press passes with an arrow. Now, because Tom Williams was working at the Williamsburg Restoration, he also had a press pass for the Richmond Times. So in case anything happened in Williamsburg, he would take pictures for the Richmond Times and send it in. So just on the off chance, he goes down and went to where the press passes was, and he didn't say anything. He walked up to the woman and laid down his press card from the Richmond Times. Well, the woman said, "Oh, how to do?" And she gave Tom all these documents and forms and everything. Well, they gave Tom a press pass. Now, the advantage of the press pass is he gets to walk inside the ropes with all the professional golfers. So he would be walking with Arnie Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and stuff, which, before when they would just come to visit, they'd have to be outside the ropes. Now he's inside the ropes walking with all the golfers and talking to them. And we found out later that what he would do, he would go to the last hole when the tournament was ending, and he would take photographs of the winning putt or the winning hole whenever the man was on the 18th hole at Harbortown Golf Tournament. He would take all these photographs. Then the next year when Tom came down, he would call up the man who won the preceding year and tell him, "Oh, I have this photo album that I took of you last year and for all these photographs." Well, then the golfer would always invite him over to his house. So he would go over for cocktails to Tom Watson's house or Green or Arnold Palmer or whoever it was. He and Sarah Louise would have drinks, and he never told us this until later on. You little stinker devil, because we never got invited over to Tom Watson's place. And it was cute because he would say, like, Tom Watson just won the tournament again this year. And rather than take her out for dinner, there's Tom Watson's wife. She's in the kitchen cooking dinner for everybody. But anyhow, so he loved his golf, and he loved coming to Hilton Head. And then Karen, as I said, Karen married George Laufer. Mom and I went to the wedding, and they live down in Woodbridge, Virginia, I believe now. Now, this is an interesting shot. This was James Briggs Minford driving an old, I don't know if that's a Model T or what kind of a car it is, but obviously it's an old car. And the interesting thing about this, if you look real close, I swear the steering wheel's on the right-hand side of the car, because Jim Minford is driving and he's sitting on the right-hand side. So I guess there was a time when they had steering wheels on the right-hand side. Now, Jim Minford always told that for his dad, which was William Minford II, he started his dad never drove. Jim Minford drove him everywhere. So Jim Minford started driving out in public at age 12, because there was no driver's licenses in those days. So he'd just drive anywhere you wanted to. Which also just reminds me, when he went to Penn State, there's another story that he told me he got a big kick out of. He would take, and he had a motorcycle, and we're talking 1916, 1915. He had a motorcycle. He would drive from Clairton, Pennsylvania to Penn State on a motorcycle in 1915 when there were hardly any paved roads. There was just ruts and dirt and tracks and stuff. It was just miserable to get to Penn State on a motorcycle in 1915. So he's going up to Penn State, and his favorite story was, he said, he was coming around a bend, and he came around a bend, and all of a sudden he saw like 10 foot in front of him, the bridge that normally went across this big, deep ravine had been washed out. And he was going real good speed, couldn't stop. Now, somebody had put a 2x12 plank across this ravine with some supports. He just froze and drove the motorcycle on the 2x12 plank all the way across the ravine, got over to the other side, and wiped out because he was because he just froze solid. Because if he'd have gone off, he'd have been killed, because it was a big distance down to the bottom of the ravine. So he gets over and he wipes out on the motorcycle on the other side. And there's an old guy sitting up against a tree, and this old guy goes to him, "By cracky, son, that was the best motorcycle driving I've ever seen in my life." My grandfather's heart was pounding because he just was lucky he wasn't dead. This is Alberta Richardson and Gertrude Richardson, probably somewhere around 1915 to 1920. Actually, Alberta Richardson was quite attractive, and Gagey was quite attractive too. They were both sisters, married two best friends from West Elizabeth, Lon Jones and Art Byers. Now, this is another one. I'm thinking if this is 1920, then that must be Lorena, because I think Lorena died in 1922 or something like that. And this is Lon Jones with Lorena shortly before she died of diabetes. Okay, this is Gagey Richardson Byers and Art Byers. Ma used to say that Art Byers used to be sort of a tough guy, that he used to, a lot of times in the old days, back in the 30s and that, he'd carry a gun. So he actually carried a gun with himself. Another interesting thing, Gertie and Art Byers live right next to Lon and Alberta Jones. Art Byers never drove a car in his life. So as a result, Art Byers and Gagey, they had to go everywhere with Lon and Alberta. So when they went to the store, to the barber shop, to the beauty shop, to the doctors, Lon Jones had to drive them everywhere. And supposedly it was because a long time ago that Art Byers tried to get a driver's license and he wrecked a car. And after that, he said he never wanted anything to do with driving a car. So that was the end of that. Jim Minford and Karen, another one of Tom Williams's picture. You can always tell that when Tom Williams takes a picture because it's very nicely framed and the people in it are centering. This was closely to the time. There was a time when Tom Williams took a photograph of Karen and I and sent it in to the Post-Gazette and won a photo contest. And as winner of that photo contest, Darlene and I think that was, Karen was down in Williamsburg, Virginia, but the winning prize was a trip to Atlantic City. So Darlene and I went out to the Allegheny County Airport on Lebanon Church Road Boulevard. We took a DC-3. Now, it was the only time I ever flew. And remember, DC-3 was a big plane in World War II. It was not pressurized, so you couldn't go above 10,000 feet. And it was bumpy as hell. And we went out to Atlantic City, and we spent a week in Atlantic City, paid for by the Post-Gazette. Okay, this is Jamie and Lon Jones. I'm guessing I was 6 months old, something like that. That's all I remember. I don't remember about this, but I remember them telling me that when I was born, we were living in Pleasant Hills. My mother's, the water broke, and she had to go to the hospital, McGee Women's Hospital. And so she told my dad to get in the car. We were going to go to the hospital. She told Dad then, you better call them and alert them that we're coming. So Dad went into the house, and he was in the house a long time. Then he came back out, and he said, they don't have a phone number. And my mom said, McGee Women's Hospital, of course they have a phone number. Go call them. So Dad went back in the house, and he's in there a long time. He came back out. No, they don't have a phone number. So my mom, who's already in labor, she had to get out of the car, go in the house, get the phone number, call them, and tell them they're coming in. My dad was spelling McGee wrong. And if it's M-C-G-E-E, he was spelling it M-A-C-G-E-E. And there was no phone number for M-A-C-G-E-E. But you have to know my dad because he was adamantly sure that McGee Women's had no phone number. My mom said, I know that's not right. But that was Dad. That's just the way he was. Okay, this is on the far left. You can't really see, but Aunt Cora, and that's B. Wentley, Nellie Wentley, and Radcliffe, Leona Radcliffe. The B and Leona Wentley, they were old maids. Their parents had money, and they had lived quite well until the Great Depression. Their parents lost all the money, and they've been, since 1930s, they've been basically destitute. So they had no money to go anywhere, to do anything, and I know everybody felt sorry for the Wentley sisters because the Great Depression just totally destroyed them. Okay, this is the Richardson family reunion in Frostburg, Maryland from 1910. Richardson family, a lot of the families are cut out. Gage's on here in the front. You can see some pencil marks. Aunt Maggie, Aunt Cora are all circled with pictures. But the Richardson family was huge because most of the Richardson families had 9 and 10 kids each. But the section of our family, we only had 1 kid each, so we really didn't have. But that's what a Richardson family reunion in 1910. This is Lorena Jones. She lived 1910 to 1921. That was the most tragic thing that ever happened. Remember, Lorena was the one that got Ma Jones to be very religious because she said it would be terrible if I go to heaven and then when you pass away that you won't be able to come see me. So from that time on, Ma Jones was as religious as they can really come. I wanted to go over real quickly here. This Stella Minford was really as tough as can be. When I would go out there in the summertime, Stella Minford was still working at the store. So I would wake up and Stella Minford at 7 o'clock was out in the garden hoeing all the crops. I mean, they had huge numbers of crops. So she would hoe for maybe an hour and a half, come in, have breakfast. At 9 o'clock, she would go to the store with her husband. They'd open the electric appliance store. She'd stay there till 6 o'clock, come back home, make dinner, and go back out in the garden till it was so dark you couldn't see. And that was her, and she did that every single day. I never knew her to take a vacation, ever. She and Jim, to my knowledge, never went on a vacation together. Stella used to belong to an organization called the Dames of Malta, whatever that is. But she would apparently go to their convention once in a while. But she was the hardest working person I ever did see. Okay, Dean and Darlene Minford, obviously this is in a cruise. This is a captain's dinner party, I'm sure, for the cruise. They did love their cruises, as did Darlene. Said Max and Sarah Ralph went on a lot of the cruises with them. Oh, this is a good one. This is Dean Minford sitting in front of his pictures at the Three Rivers Art Festival. Now, when Darlene went to college, she was a music major and she minored in art. And she would always her whole life had been big on painting, and she took classes on different styles of painting. And while she was at Clarendon Avenue, Dean Minford used to watch her do these paintings, and he thought that looked easy. So he started to do paintings. And I used to always call Dad's paintings were the Neolithic caveman technique. I mean, his pictures were disproportionate and they weren't good. So this is in the old days when you had to be selected to be in the Three Rivers Art Festival. So Mom and Dad both took paintings down to the Three Rivers Art Festival. And of course, you can imagine what happens. Darlene, who was a wonderful painter, her paintings were rejected, and Dean Minford's paintings were accepted for the Three Rivers Art Festival. And that just blew my mom's mind. She just thought that was so ridiculous and terrible. Now, the thing that really was funny was I was sitting at home one day, and it was when Dad had was down at the Three Rivers Art Festival. And there comes a thing on Channel 13. We're watching Channel 13, and there's the art critic going around to different paintings and describing different paintings and what technique they were and all this stuff. And all of a sudden, she comes to Dean Minford's paintings, and she shows him these paintings in this picture. And the art critic said, "Oh, if you notice that the person who painted this, he was using the parts of the body were disproportionate. This was to show lotta, and then it would show the colors and the screens." And my mom is sitting at home on the couch screaming, "No, it doesn't. It shows he doesn't know how to paint. He doesn't know how to do anything." And Mom was screaming and yelling and throwing stuff at the TV set. And Dad couldn't understand why, because he thought this was very normal. Now, if you look at the picture on the bottom here, this is important, because I was there when Dad had to put these up. That picture on the bottom with the little gold thing on the side and the blue square or something, that picture was originally to be held 90 degrees rotated. When you put the picture up the way Dad had painted it, it stuck out over the bottom of the board that you had to put your paintings on. And a judge came by and said, "Sorry, sir, but you can't use that painting because you're not allowed to extend over the border of the panel." So Dad took this long and not too narrow picture, rotated it 90 degrees. Now he had a narrow but not too long picture, and that's the only one he sold. He sold it for $90, and it's hanging. So somebody's got this painting hanging sideways in their house. My mom just lost her mind on that one. And the other thing that was that Mom was in music. That was her music major in college. And Dean had a great voice. Mom and Dad met each other in Clairton High School choir. Clairton at that time had an octet and a double octet, and every year they would make the state finals in music. And Dean and Darlene were both in the octet and the double octet. And so that's where Dean and Darlene met. But Dean then decided to, so when I grew up, Mom was the choir director of the New Kensington Methodist Church. Dad was the choir director of the Arnold Methodist Church. Dad was also choir director of the New Kensington Synagogue. And it was so fascinating because Dad said he would actually ended up then after he became the cantor in the Jewish synagogue. Now, of course, everything is in Hebrew. So they just had to teach Dad how to pronounce the Hebrew words. So he would get up and belt these songs out and just rattle the window panes in the building. And these people used to come the day after the service was over in the synagogue, and they'd say, "Oh, Dr. Minford, I never heard that song sang with more emotion and more passion than what you did it. It was just spectacular." And Dad used to thank them and smile, and he'd come home. He'd say, I didn't have a clue what I was saying. He had no idea because he didn't know what the Hebrew words meant. They just taught him how to do it. Now, Lon Jones was a piano player, and his signature piece, and I think I have it on tape somewhere, he used to play Stars and Stripes Forever that would just knock your socks off. I mean, his hands was flying up and down that keyboard doing dun 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 dun, and he would just go and go and go, and he was really a spectacular. Now, my mom and dad used to sing a lot, and they would do duets, but my dad used to get mad at his father-in-law because Pop, he would always play he could transpose instantly, up a couple of notes, down a couple of notes, whatever. So he would always transpose the song that they were singing into Darlene's key, which would be out of key for Dean. So Dad used to always get upset because, yeah, but your dad always plays those pieces in your key, not in Dad's key. Dad also was in Pittsburgh Savonards, which they do Gilbert and Sullivan musicals, and he used to participate in those all the time. Now, Dad's acting was hideous, but his singing was really fantastic. Okay, there's Darlene. I'm guessing junior high school, pretty somewhere around in there. So that was a picture of Darlene. Also, I didn't know this just till recently when I was going through to make this up. I didn't realize that my dad had a quartet when he lived in Pleasant Hills, and the name of the quartet was the Sharps. And the Sharps consisted of Dick Dodd, Bob McMichael, and my dad, and I forget who the other one was. But anyhow, they had a musical group, and they would go around to different things, and they would sing as a quartet. Helen Hirth was the director, and she also played the piano. Okay, that's a picture of the farm. That was the entrance to the farm. Pop Jim had the entire farm enclosed with fence, and that was the gate. This was real early on because later on the trees just covered everything. But Ma Stella used to grow a lot of vegetables, and they took them to the local supermarket to sell. She would be always selling tomatoes and squash and peppers to Marcini's supermarket in Clairton. She was good friends with Joe Marcini. Okay, that's Gagey and Uncle Art again. I think that was in their 50th wedding anniversary, I think. Oh, there's Dean Minford in his uniform for the Pittsburgh Savonards, where he would sing Gilbert and Sullivan musicals. Dad, they loved Dad. He was a great singer, but just don't give him anything that he had to act, because his acting was really hokey. I mean, it was really bad, but his singing was out of this world. Yeah, it's on 78. We're getting to the end. This is Robert Minford, Rachel Minford, and Megan Minford. This was taken out at our house. John and Terry came out to visit us. I tell you, one of the things that I remember in my entire life was Rachel's wedding. Rachel's wedding was the most spectacular wedding I've ever been to. I mean, it was just so nice. The only thing that I always felt bad, we should have had Rachel's wedding last, because having Rachel's wedding first, that puts all kind of pressure under me to try to compete with Uncle John's wedding, because there's no way we could compete. So you should have had the weaker weddings first and then end with Rachel's wedding, the grand finale. But that was just a beautiful wedding and a beautiful time. Now, this is interesting. This is a photograph of the stained glass window in the West Elizabeth Methodist Church that was commemorating the death of Lorena Jones. They put, when Lorena passed away, Lon and Bertie paid to have the have this put in the window. And one of the things that I've wanted to do, and I'm still going to try to do it if it's at all possible, I'd like to, because I think the West Elizabeth Church isn't used anymore. So what I think I'd really like to do is to go over and buy this stained glass pane that has Lorena Jones's name in it, and bring it here in the house or something like that. But I took a picture here. I guess I took that in probably 1980, maybe 1990. So the stained glass is still there. And I'm sure most of the people in the church have no idea who Lorena Jones is, because she died in 1920. Okay, this is the West Elizabeth Methodist Church. These are where the stained glass windows are on. Also, the two red doors are the doors that Alberta Richardson Jones and Gertrude Richardson Byers went in dressed as Ku Klux Klan members to the Methodist men meeting one night and put $1 in a collection plate. That was one of their piece de resistance, was one of their tricks, man. But they were afraid after a while. Okay, this is the window with Lorena Jones at the bottom. This is a whole picture of the stained glass. Also, there's some pictures in this of the Williams family. Now, that's Tom Williams, Karen's dad. Karen's dad was Tom Williams, and there's stained glass windows I think there's 2 stained glass windows from the Williams family in this church. Okay, this is Alberta Jones with baby Lorena. Lorena had just been born. That was with Maud. I'm sure it was a formal picture taken. At that time, I don't know if they knew whether Lorena was that sick or not. Probably not at that age. Now, this is Lorena Jones at age 7. And she used to dress up, and she would sing and dance and do skits and put on plays. And she just loved to be in front of the people. And everybody loved her. She was really, really popular. And I told you that when she did pass away, they closed the West Elizabeth School so that all the kids could go to the funeral. Okay, Dean and Darlene. Now, what did I say about Darlene? Mink coat again. Every time you see, if it's at all humanly possible, she's got a mink coat. She loves her mink coats, always did. And there is Dean. I think this is whenever they were up in Harvard, because Dad went to school in Harvard to learn to be the ACORN unit, to be a communications officer. So Darlene was up living. I think he was up there for 6 months studying to be in an ACORN unit. This is Alberta Jones and Lon Jones's 50th anniversary gala out at the farm. I remember going to this. As a matter of fact, I swear I had to sing a song, which of course my mom forced me to do, and I hated to do it, but anyhow. But I never saw so many. They had big big picnic tables out there that Papa Jim had set up. Big picnic table just filled with gold stuff. I mean, gold vases and pictures and dishes and you name it, because everything was a golden anniversary. So they had so much stuff. That was also the last time I ever saw Wilford. Was at the 50th anniversary. That was Lon Jones's blind brother. By the way, just as a quick side note, I always only thought that Lon Jones had 3 brothers, that there were just the 4 brothers in the Jones family. But I got a phone call a number of years ago from somebody calling up and asking me about the Jones family. And here there was a girl in the family. The first child born was a girl, and she passed away within 1 year. And then the 4 boys were born. So it actually was 5 kids, 1 girl, and 4 boys. Dean and Darlene, I think that was their 25th anniversary cake. I don't remember where the party was, but we have a lot of pictures in that upstairs. I included this. This is to get to the other side of family. This is in case nobody's ever seen. This is Russell Simmons. This is Kathy's dad. Nicest guy in the world. I mean, it's amazing. There's certain people that everybody just like. And everybody likes Russell. And even after he passed away, and I'd have people come into the office that had worked with Russell, and they said, "Oh, Russell was a great guy. I wonder if Russell was a wonderful guy." He just always smiled. Now, Russell lost his hearing. He was born able to hear, but he got a disease in his childhood and lost his hearing. So as time went by, he lost the ability to speak. He originally could speak, but then after not being able to hear anything, he couldn't actually pronounce the words. So that was close to their anniversary out at our house. Here's Megan. Megan was a beautiful young lady. Megan's graduation from Burrell High School. I see Burrell High School. I don't know what they're going to do for school this year, but whatever. Robert Minford. Robert, that's John's son. Robert was a handsome guy, I tell you. And it's amazing, when they were growing up, Robert and Connor looked a lot alike. I mean, if you stood them side by side, you would swear that Robert was an older brother and Connor was the younger brother, because they really looked a lot alike. I feel bad for this. There's Terry in the foreground, Rachel in the background, and Rachel's husband, Tim Molyneux. I'm sorry, Tim. This is the only picture I have of you, so I couldn't get a better one, but that's the only one I had. So that was with, I think, Connor's high school graduation out at our place when we had a big picnic. And John and Terry, Rachel and Tim, they all came. Now, that's Kathy's parents, Russell and Nancy Simmons. As I said, Russell was a sweetheart, as was Nancy. They were both just wonderful people. I always felt bad for Russell and Nancy. There was one year that we had a dental convention in Hawaii. Now, Kathy's sister, Joanne, is married to a dentist in Erie. So we decided that we wanted to go to the dental convention. The 4 of us were going to go to the dental convention because we could write it off. So we had just had a baby that was about a year old, and Steve and Joanne had a baby that was 30 days older. So basically we had 2 babies a year old. So when the 4 of us went to the convention in Hawaii, we dumped our babies off with Russell and Nancy. So for a whole week, they had to take care of 2 babies, and they said it was an ordeal. They weren't ready to take care of 2 babies at one time, and that probably wasn't real nice. We probably shouldn't have done that. But Kath and Steve and Joanne and I, we had a really nice time in Hawaii. Dean Minford. Now, this is the Dean that I remembered from up in the nursing home. This was Dean, and he was up in a nursing home. I would go up probably 4 times a week. We'd sit and talk, and we would talk about all these different things. That's how I learned a lot of the information and stories, because when Dean was 93, I was the only person he could talk to who knew all these people. So when he talked about Aunt Pline and Jim and Stella and Uncle Frank, I'm the only one that knew who they were. Nobody else had any idea. So Dad always enjoyed talking to me because I could tell him all about all the other people. And he had a good time up at the Concordia Nursing Home in Sarver. It was a really nice place. Dad was just sort of hard to get along with, but aside from that. Okay, this was Connor playing football. Connor's, I think, 63 or something like that. I wanted to put this in. Connor did really well playing football. And the one game they had, it was the one year they were playing against Kiski area. And Kiski area was a much bigger school than Borough, more students. So they're playing football against them. Connor was playing left tackle, and the game was nothing, getting toward the end of the game, and Burrow was driving. We got down to like the 5-yard line, and the coach called out a special play. They pulled Connor out of left tackle and put him over right between right guard and right tackle, which was Bates was the right tackle. And anyhow, they put Connor right in the backfield, and they gave the ball to the running back, and all three, the right guard, Connor, and the right Bates, the right tackle, they just drove straight ahead and plowed through and knocked all the Kiski guys down on the ground, and Burl ended up winning that game 6-0. That was a good game. This was Megan for a prom. I'm guessing it was a prom. I'm not sure. Megan would know better than me. Very, very, very beautiful young lady. Okay, there's Kathy, Terry, and John. I think we're at one of Rachel's horse things, or else it looks like it's cold. A couple of times Rachel had these equestrian shows. It got sort of nippy outside, but Rachel was really good in equestrian events. She had her horse, and she really did a nice job and was very, very, very pretty. Looked great up on the horse. She was just a beautiful young lady. There's Rachel at the equestrian show. She won a lot of awards. I mean, she would come home with medals and trophies and all kinds of stuff. But that was it's the only time I ever went to an equestrian show. It was really quite nice. This was the only time in my life that I paid to have a suit made just for me.
Oh, God, it's that ugly white one.
Oh, Kathy hates this suit. I had this made for a cruise, and this was snow white. And the vest had gold buttons, and the cuffs had gold buttons, and the shirt.
Before we ever got married.
Shirt had black frillies on the outside of the shirt, and I had snow white floor shine shoes to wear with this. I tell you, I was the cat's meow wearing this suit, baby. I mean, it was really something. This is a nice picture of the Simmons family. Now, this is Kathy's family. Going around, starting on the left-hand side, we have Aunt Joanne. Going up to Uncle Steve, Uncle Billy, Aunt Janet, me, Kathy, coming around down to the front corner. In the middle and the bottom is Michael. Then Zachary. Then going up you have Megan. Moving over to the right is Rachel. Going up is Sarah, and going over is Mackenzie. So these are the 3 Simmons kids and their families. I wanted to put that in. Okay, this is a picture of George Richardson Jr. They are the children of Alice Bird and George Richardson Sr. Now, George Richardson Sr. was a traveling Methodist minister in the Eckert, Maryland area. George Richardson Jr. is sitting in the middle next to his sister. A lot of people that look at this picture think that Jim Minford, which is me, that I look a lot like George Richardson Jr. I don't know if that's true or not, but a lot of people tell me that. Next photograph is Grandma Powell. Grandma Powell, she's also known as Mary Ann McDonald. Oh, Mary Ann McDonald. She married in 1846 McDonald, who died in a coal mine, and then she married Mr. Powell. So actually, Grandma Powell could also be called Grandma McDonald because McDonald was the father of all the kids that we're related to. Powell had no children. Next picture is James Briggs Minford in the military Pittsburgh Academy Military School. His photograph. He was the head cadet, the Corps cadet, who marched in front of everybody. Another interesting bit of trivia. There's no photograph for this, but J.B. Minford used to always to love to tell the story. J.B. Minford had his Studebaker dealership, and he had a dog named Jack. And J.B. loved Jack. Now, Jack was a huge, big German Shepherd. Now, right next to Clairton was another town called Blair, Pennsylvania. Blair, Pennsylvania, on Edward R. Murrow's national radio program one year, said that Blair, Pennsylvania was the toughest town in the United States of America. They were averaging 1 murder per day in Blair, Pennsylvania. Now, Blair's right next to Wilson. When there was a murder or something like that, the police chief, who was good friends with Grandpa Minford, he would call up and ask my grandfather to bring down Jack. Now, Jack was this big, mean dog. So he would bring Jack down, and he said there was one time they were having a crap game and somebody got mad and somebody killed another guy and a dead body's laying on the ground. And my grandfather brings in Jack, and Jack is frothing at the mouth and swirling and jumping. And the one guy sitting over in the backside goes, "Gee whiz, the body's just dead and the bloodhounds is here already." So my grandfather always loved that about Jack. And the interesting thing, Jack was let go in an automobile garage. My grandfather would leave him loose every night in the garage. And in like the 15, 20 years that Jack was alive, nobody ever robbed my grandfather's store because everybody knew Jack, and everybody knew that Jack was running around the store, so nobody wanted to mess with him. And the final little, I don't know if I should mention this, but this was Dean Minford's thing that drove Dean Minford crazy was the great Minford financial mystery. Now, you have to remember that Jim Minford had a Studebaker garage built for him by his grandfather, William Minford II, and he had a Studebaker garage for 30 years, and he was the top seller guy in town. He had an electric appliance store that he had, and he sold everything after the Second World War, and he had the farm. Then when Jim Minford passed on, his wife passed on 2 years later, Stella, when Dean, when he went down for his mother, he moved down to Port Charlotte, Florida, and she had cancer and she passed on. Dad was absolutely shocked that including the house in Port Charlotte, Florida, and all the furniture and everything, the only money that Stella Minford had was $50,000. And Dad just couldn't believe that because the Minfords, their whole life, had all of this money just out the wazoo, and Dad could never figure what the hell happened to it because they never went on vacations, they never gambled, they never drank, they never did anything. And so Dad was always sure that Jim Minford had stashed away a bunch of money someplace, and when he passed on, nobody knew where it was because, and same with Ma Jones. Well, we told Ma Jones this, and Ma Jones told her friends in Clairton. Everybody in Clairton thought that the Minfords were the wealthiest family in town, and nobody would believe that Dean Minford only got $50,000 out of the car store, the appliance store, the farm, plus anything they had made doing. So that was always, to Dad's dying day, he still was upset that he felt there was something missing someplace. He didn't know whatever happened. Okay, I hope you've all enjoyed this. I've told you about everything that I know, so enjoy and have a good time.